All right, so the numbers have stopped clicking up on Zoom, so I'll go ahead and get started. A few housekeeping notes. First of all, for those of you attending virtually, we do have a live captioning service available. So should you want or need that, then go ahead and press the closed captioning button on your Zoom, and you should be able to follow along that way. Also, we will be using the Q&A button rather than the chat for questions for our speakers afterwards. So please engage in the conversation with us, those of you who are at home, but use the Q&A rather than the chat. For those of you who are here live, if you do engage in question and answer, I will repeat your question so that it's audible to the audience at home. So it can be a little bit awkward, but at least that way everyone can hear what we're asking and what we're saying. All right. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Brad Grimes, who is the program coordinator at West Virginia University's LGBTQ Center. As the program coordinator, he develops and implements advocacy programming and training opportunities for the center's communities, both on and off campus. And I have had the privilege of working with Brad on several projects, and his creativity and enthusiasm for social justice and making the West Virginia University campus a more inclusive place are inspiring as a colleague. And now we are excited to have him tell us a little bit about his impressions of our exhibition, True Colors, Picturing Identity. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for that wonderful and warm introduction. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of the artworks featured in Picturing Identity, True Colors. And I really want to talk about my impressions about how some of these artworks and the artists that made them really made significant inroads and did significant contributions to LGBTQ visibility, and as such helped really bring awareness to and kind of put LGBTQ identities into the mainstream. So in this exhibition, we're going to see representations of identities that, as Carrie James Marshall, an artist who is featured here, says, have all too often been, quote, historically omitted from the canon of Western art history, end quote. These identities have too long been missing from museum and gallery walls, art history books, and popular discourse. So this wonderful exhibition is a meaningful correction to that omission, as we have here a collection that celebrates diversity, both of the artists featured and their brilliant works that bring marginalized identities to the front of our contemplation. Here we see art that meaningfully incorporates Black, Puerto Rican, Jewish, Indigenous, female, and LGBTQ identities, among others, into our collective awareness. So this afternoon, my talk will focus on the LGBTQ+/queer artists and their works in the collection. And I want to say that I'm not going to be able to cover everyone because of time constraints, but I'm doing a few that especially speak to me. So I'm going to share some of my thoughts and impressions on how these artists, through their work, have helped render LGBTQ identities visible and culturally relevant. So visibility is the most essential and empowering aspect for anyone's identity. We all need to feel seen as who we truly are and to have our multiple identities validated and affirmed. Historically, LGBTQ and queer people have had their identities marginalized, suppressed, oppressed, dismissed, and even erased. This is largely because Western culture is heavily heteronormative, meaning that heterosexuality is viewed as the, quote, gold standard and as the only proper and valid way of being. So those who do not conform to this supposed standard have historically been labeled as deviants, perverts, sodomites, and queers. Those who do not or cannot adhere to heteronormativity have been persecuted, prosecuted, ridiculed, discriminated against, cast out, and deemed lesser. Centuries of this abuse and censure had the cumulative effect of driving non-heteronormative people into the shadows and into hiding, sometimes referred to as being in the closet. Moreover, those who dared to be visible were frequently subjected to cruel attempts to cure them of their homosexuality. So I'm teaching a class right now, LGBTQ rights and the law. And we talked about how beginning in like 1952, the American Psychiatric Association included homosexuality as a mental disorder in their diagnostic statistical manual, the DSM. And it would remain there until 1973 when it was finally removed as a pathological psychiatric mental disorder. So that's the bad news. The good news is homosexuality was perceived as something that was treatable. So in those, in attempts toward that, gay people were subjected to some really horrific alleged treatments and cures, such as ice pick lobotomies. This was happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Gay people were institutionalized. They were subjected to electroshock aversion therapies, which is also known as conversion therapy, which sadly, many of you may have heard about, is still practiced today. Fortunately, Morgantown has passed a municipal ordinance banning the practice of conversion therapy, so that's good. But the takeaway is that like many gay people were subjected to really like cruel and basically torture and futile attempts to cure them of their identity, of their homosexuality and their sexual orientation. So things begin to change with the Stonewall protests, the Stonewall riots in June of 1969. When for the first time, not for the first time, but for the most significant time, LGBTQ people really stood up to a lot of the police harassment and abuse that they were encountering. And post-Stonewall, and during the early days of the gay sexual revolution of the 1970s, and like also into the 1980s, the emergence of an LGBTQ identity kind of took place as a political identity. And with that, visibility plus demands for rights led to more rights and legal protections for the LGBTQ plus community. So it was really like just decades of being harassed, shunted into the corners, forced to stay in the closet, raids on our sanctuaries and our gay bars and safe spaces, police brutality, just indiscriminate arrests. All of that came to a head in Stonewall. And after that, there was kind of a coalescence of a gay identity that was really started to flourish in the 70s and 80s. A quick note on terminology. Gay, lesbian, and bisexual morphed into the acronym LGBTQ, which also adds transgender and queer. We at the center like to include a plus, LGBTQ plus, for inclusivity. We recognize that there are many, many kinds of sexual orientations and many kinds of gender identities. So the plus is inclusive. If you see the acronym written out, it can be like 15 letters long. But we just go with LGBTQ plus to be inclusive and understand that like there are many, many ways of being, whether that's sexual or gender identity. Now that we have a sense of what we mean when we talk about LGBTQ identity, it's important to note that all of us have multiple identities, all of which need to be validated and affirmed for us to be treated as whole people. This notion is called intersectionality. So I want to draw your attention here to the slide. When we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about all of the ways that like social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, et cetera, give an individual or a group, and they create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage. By that, I mean, all of us have these various identities, our race, our ethnicity, our gender, our age, our sexual orientation, our ability status, whether or not we're a member of the dominant or the majority culture, our socioeconomic status, our religion, right? So we carry around all of these, all coexisting and intersecting at the same time. And that's what we're talking about by intersectionality. But like, you know, we're not, and we're multifaceted people. No one is just one identity, right? We carry with us and are many identities coexisting and intersecting together all at one time. And the important thing is that we need all of our multiple identities to be affirmed and validated, to feel like whole people. That's what intersectionality is about. So when thinking about the artwork in this collection, I think it's valuable to consider the intersecting identities of each artist. And for LGBTQ people, our sexual orientation or gender identity is superimposed on and coexists with our racial, ethnic, religious, biological sex, age, socioeconomic, just all of our identities. So people come in, like some of the artists will come in today, some will be Black, some will be white. But in addition to that identity, there is their age. There's also their sexual orientation or the way they identify their gender. So all of these things matter. And I think all of these things inform the art that we're going to be looking at today. And I think it's important, I think it's valuable to step back and when looking at anything, to consider all of these various identities so that we can see it gives us a better understanding of where they were coming from. And I think it informs our take on the art a lot. So I'm going to start with Vanessa German, The Great American Roller Coaster Ride, 2017. I really love this piece. There's just so much going on, and it's visually spectacular, I think. So Vanessa German is a Pittsburgh-based artist who identifies as female, African-American, and queer, and has experienced the hardships that come along with these labels. I say hardships because all three of those are marginalized identities: female, African-American, queer, right? So they're minoritized, marginalized identities. And that the more our intersecting identities can take us toward privilege or can take us, away from privilege. So members of more marginalized and minoritized groups are further removed from privilege than people who are more dominant or more majoritarian aspect or group. So in intersectionality terms, each of these identities, her femaleness, her African-Americanness, and her queerness factor into how much marginalization she experiences. But despite that marginalization, German creates these wonderful power figures, is the term she uses to call them. And they feature a plethora of found objects purposefully attached to Black dolls. As a self-described citizen artist, German uses her role as an artist to authoritatively express her concern about today's issues, dealing with identity, gender, violence, and discrimination. Racism and mental health crisis are themes she also explores in her works. So a couple of my impressions about this work. So she is an African-American woman, so I love her choice of using a Black doll. Are any of you familiar with the novel The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison? It's a very, to me, a sad novel about a little Black girl who, she wants a white doll because in her mind, in her young mind, that is the only standard of beauty. So, I love that Vanessa German purposefully uses Black dolls in her art. She's a queer woman, so that makes me think, I see this gold mask on the Black doll. And the gold mask makes me think about some of the ways that we disguise or hide our identities. Do we feel that we have to? Some LGBTQ people feel that they have to hide their identities for their personal safety, for career advancement, any number of reasons that LGBTQ people may have to or may feel pressured or just feel that they have to hide and not let their true identity be seen. So that mask, that gold mask, makes me really think about a lot of those questions about, in terms of identities, the ways, do we hide them or not? Behind this power figure is a mirror. And I wonder if the mirror is so that we can all see our multiple intersecting identities when we're experiencing this piece, or is it so that we can see our reflections to this incredible Black girl on skates with a carnival on her head? We're seeing this amazing, empowered power figure, and I wonder if the mirror is somehow to catch our own reflection of our reactions to that. wow. I see some symbolism in this piece. So I was caught right away by the string bindings on the arms and kind of the upper torso. And that made me think about, maybe some of the ways that we do or can feel bound by our identities. Sometimes, aspects of our identity, things like race, can feel immutable and inescapable. I mean, like other identities, other aspects of our identities can change, and we can change our religion, we can change our socioeconomic class, our age, like it or not, despite our best efforts, changes, right? So, but sometimes identities, some aspects of our identity can feel really just inescapable. German talks about, though, the binding as swaddling, suggesting comfort and nurturing. So when I read that about her take on that, something that I saw as like constricting or, constraining, she sees as nurturing and swaddling, comforting. So I thought that was really interesting. So all of that makes me question, do we fight and resist our identities? I think that many LGBTQ queer people sometimes struggle, at least initially, to accept and embrace their queer identity. I know as a young person, I kept praying that it would just be a phase, that my sexual orientation, that my gayness would go away, or that I would outgrow it, or that, this would not be my destiny. So I had a hard time embracing and getting comfortable with my own identity. Or conversely, using German's take on the bindings as swaddling, do we nurture and celebrate our queer identities? I think this comes with time, and as it happens, it really starts to feel like empowerment. But that's what some of that symbolism really is, some of the things that it made me think about. We also see cowrie shells, which to me is a symbol of a kind of a nod toward her African heritage. And we see keys, symbols of access and opportunity. And I kind of throw this question out, why do you think access and opportunity, why would these be important to a Black queer woman? This is something I'd like you to kind of take a minute to think about. Like, so someone who is triple marginalized, right? Why would keys and access and opportunities, as keys as symbols of those things, why would that matter or be important and be like prominently displayed in her power figures' jewelry or maybe even armor? We see here the American flag, and being Black, queer, and a woman in America, that is to say, juggling multiple marginalized identities, must feel like a roller coaster ride, at times thrilling, chilling, with its ups and downs, but also, a reminder too that as marginalized identities, sometimes we're made to feel like second-class citizens, even in our own country. So I think many LGBTQ and queer people can relate to sometimes feeling less than, or treated like they're treated as second-class citizens in a land that's guarantees or whose ideal is liberty and justice for all. All right, and then lastly with this, we see this power figure on skates. And part of me wants to think that she's just out there having a lot of fun. But another part of me has to think that is all of this about instability? She's balancing all of these identities, right? The artist is balancing all of her multiple identities, and this power figure is juggling and balancing all of that she's carrying while on skates. Does that signify or denote a lack of secure footing? We all try to balance all of our intersectional identities and stand as whole people. So I don't know whether to read this as the skates as that here's a power figure sailing through life on skates having fun, or if it's I'm balancing the carnival of all of my various identities, and it's fragile and it's not stable. Those are just some of the thoughts I had with this piece. I want to talk next about Keith Haring and his work of art called Untitled, made in 1988. So Keith Haring was an openly gay artist and an outspoken AIDS activist. He was diagnosed with HIV and AIDS in 1988 and died in 1990 at the age of 31, so a very young man. He was determined to fully incorporate his homosexuality as an integral facet of his art, in spite of the homophobia and oppression that many of his predecessors had suffered throughout history. So Haring's art reflected what was happening socially and politically around him. It's impossible to talk about LGBTQ identity without talking about the AIDS epidemic, which was instrumental in the coalescence of 1980s LGBTQ identity. So what I love about Keith Haring's work is that we see a shift happening in the, some of the early works, especially these characters. Like here we see joyousness and exuberance, men dancing together, right? But I just love the vibrancy, like those strokes of portraying the action. There's such aliveness and such vibrancy in this. And I love this piece, and I think this is kind of how I think of Keith Haring's work when I think about his body of work as a whole. I remember like in the 80s and 90s seeing this, and this is kind of, for me, prototypical of Keith Haring. But it's really different from the piece that we have here in this exhibition. But I'll talk a little bit more about what was going on in the 80s and the coalescence of LGBTQ identity because of largely the AIDS epidemic. So the 80s and 90s were a very polarized time for gay men and gay people. On the one hand, there was like this freedom of sexuality and sexual identity that was newly found and post Stonewall in the 1970s. This was kind of a new thing, and people were really celebrating being able to enjoy and have their sexual freedom and this kind of formation of an LGBTQ kind of political identity. But on the other hand, there was a fierce battle for survival from AIDS that was also coexisting at the same time. So there's a kind of polarized dichotomy of celebration, joy, sexual freedom, and survival from a plague that was killing so many people. Haring, like all men of his generation, had in his own life to accept that sex and love could be associated with the ideas of illness and death. And there's a great quote that said, Haring's art can be viewed as, quote, a fight against illness and for the freedom of minds and bodies, a true hymn to life and to love, end quote. And that's from Sex is Life is Sex by Jerome de Normand in his gallery. But sex, symbol of the regeneration and transmission of life, soon becomes the vector of death when it appears in the early 80s as the specter of AIDS that Keith Haring was sadly to die of in 1990. Much of Haring's work and art was about safer sex, AIDS, and LGBTQ activism. So here in this slide, we see a work that kind of exemplifies this AIDS activism. We see that the figures in this work are marked with X's. We also see that they are, at the same time that there's like, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, but they seem to be screaming, and I see the middle character jumping up and down, stomping, like, we have to talk about this. Ignorance equals fear, silence equals death, fight AIDS, act up. So I see this like as a very powerful, protest piece. Like, we have to, our community is dying and we have to do something. So it was really, I also think when I think about ACT UP and safer and AIDS activism, I also think of Keith Haring. So I want to contrast both of these works with the one in this exhibition, Untitled 1988, made the year Haring learned of his AIDS diagnosis. So I think this is really starkly different from the joyous, vibrant, exuberant, dancing figures that we saw earlier. It's even different from the the protest pieces, like the ACT UP and AIDS activist themed works. Here, I see a man in disintegration. I see, like, you notice that behind the bold, the black sketch, there's like this gray element. And to me, that kind of symbolizes like spirit or a ghost emerging. And I always wonder if newly diagnosed with AIDS, knowing that he was going to die, that doesn't symbolize for Haring maybe the beginning of the start of giving up the ghost, an acknowledgement and like a realization that he was, an acceptance, maybe not acceptance, but like an awareness that death wasn't far away. Like seeing many friends, lovers, and just other men of his generation die so quickly from AIDS. That had to be on his mind. So that's what I see in this. I see kind of a disintegration of form and kind of a giving up of the ghost in that. I also wonder if he's holding a whip, and I don't know if the purpose of the whip is to try to tame willful sexual desire, which maybe he sees as being responsible for his condition. I don't know. The vibrancy of, I'm accused of seeing everything in sexual terms by my friends. They're like, you make everything sexual. But I don't know. I see this character who I do, while disintegrating and maybe starting to like fade, I see vibrancy. Is that a penis? Is that like, I don't know what to make of that, but it seems to me like it could be, one take on that is that like, well, I may be going and fading, but I'm still sexual. I still value my sexual identity. So it can be read a couple of different ways. All right. I think it's a very powerful piece, though, and it's a sad piece for me. It's not like the happy, joyous Keith Haring that I really, I think, remember. Up next, Andy Warhol, ladies and gentlemen, 1975. So Warhol openly expressed his queer identity in life and art, even when homosexuality was criminalized and suppressed in the United States. So gay sex actually was criminalized in some states in this country up until 2003, when the Supreme Court deemed sodomy laws, which were often used to persecute and prosecute gay people, unconstitutional. So that was in 2003. So that's an important takeaway that, in some states, in some places in the United States, being gay was a crime, was illegal, right? So Andy Warhol also celebrated and explored celebrity with his famous paintings and silk screens of Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, Jackie O, Grace Jones, Debbie Harry, Mick Jagger. And he also explored American identity. So, and ladies and gentlemen, we have a portrait series of trans women and drag queens. Originally commissioned by an Italian patron who wanted portraits of transvestites. The significance of, I think, these paintings and these works is that they helped bring transgender identities and expression into the public eye. For years, the subjects were unlabeled and anonymous, the subjects of Warhol's portrait of paintings, well, photographs. The patrons of the models of his work were unlabeled and anonymous until 2014. We still know little about many of them and their identities. We really don't even know necessarily the terminology that these folks would apply to themselves. The word transvestite now is not really in currency. Today we have transgender, and talking about like labels for gender expression and gender identity, but it's hard to know like what these people what terminology they used to describe themselves. Was it drag queens? Did they call themselves? I know that Marsha P Johnson, she used the terminology transvestite, but was that the only language and terminology available to them then? This, again, this is before the words like transgender that we have today. So it's hard to know how these people would have described or classified themselves. Many of the subjects for Warhol's works in this series were recruited from the Gilded Grape, a Manhattan bar popular with New York City's Black and Latinx trans women and drag queens. Warhol made 500 photographs of 14 models. There are Polaroid photos, which were then silk screened. So 500 photographs, that's a lot of interest in this little known kind of marginalized group of people. Warhol was not part of this community, but he did profit from it, and the models did not. They were paid $50 each for their photo shoots, and many never saw the finished portraits. The series does, though, cast a spotlight on some well-known figures in the transgender community, such as prominent LGBTQ civil rights activist and drag queen Marsha P Johnson, who is perhaps the most well-known, largely due to her activism and advocacy for gay and trans rights. Johnson was a vanguard participant in the Stonewall Uprising and co-founder of the radical activist organizations STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. So if we could go to slide 128. Here we see model Isha McKee. And I think this is really a stunning portrait. There's such a diva aura to this. And it's this work is also, some of the terms that have been applied to it are staggering self-confidence or very intense. I've also read about there's an incredible highness, and I don't know how to interpret highness. But this person does have a very dreamy, expression on her face. So I just think this is I love the colors. Everything about this work is dramatic, it's dynamic. I think it's wonderful. If we could go to the next one, please, slide 130. In this one, we see the model is Wilhelmina Ross. And of the series, this particular portrait might be the most understated in the whole series. But it's important to note, and even though this is kind of understated compared to the first one, especially where we saw all that vibrancy and that kind of dreaminess and diva aura, this is kind of more subdued. But despite that, Wilhelmina Ross appears to have been one of Warhol's favorite models for the Ladies and Gentlemen series. He made 73 paintings based on 7 Polaroids, 29 drawings, and 5 collage portraits of Ross. He also created 5 giant 10-foot canvases of her. So Wilhelmina Ross was born Douglas Mitchell Hunter in Kansas City, Missouri, and moved to New York in 1970. Her name was a mix of the model agency Wilhelmina Models and Warhol's close friend, Diana Ross. And Wilhelmina Ross was a member of a drag theater company and became its leading star. So, Wilhelmina was one of, I think, a muse for Andy Warhol. And it surprises me that, therefore, that she might have the most understated or even kind of subdued portrait in the thing, but just he was very fascinated with Wilhelmina. I think earlier we saw the picture of Andy, his self-portrait in drag, and we did see the Warhol drag queen Polaroids. So lots of fascination. The takeaway is that Warhol was bringing this visibility of a subculture that was not well known, not mainstream. He made it visible and he celebrated it. And he challenged people to make of it what they would. But for much of mainstream America, this was their first exposure to these identities, to these people and these identities. All right, I'd like to talk next about Robert Maplethorpe, Gold Mirror Cross, 1983. Robert Maplethorpe is best known for his powerful black and white portraits and self-portraits. It was soon after his death in 1989 from HIV/AIDS complications that Maplethorpe's work ran into controversy when US politician Jesse Helms pinpointed it as a threat to American values. And that makes me think, well, whose American values, right? Like, I mean, maybe it was a threat to white heteronormative cisgender values, but it wasn't an affront to queer and LGBTQ values or standards, which again, historically being kind of taken out of the picture, removed from the picture, omitted, erased. It's his work being displayed in the National Gallery of Art and in prominent exhibitions was really important and groundbreaking because of the visibility it gave to LGBTQ and queer identities. Maplethorpe is known for photographs depicting gay sex and intimacy in a way that had previously been hidden behind curtains. I love this photograph. When it was shown in like 1989, or this is Two Men Dancing, 1984, to mainstream audiences, it may have been shocking and provocative just because of the subject matter. Two men dancing, presumably gay men. That maybe that shockingness or the transgression of like putting this out there, maybe that was what many people saw as the power of this work. But to me, the power of this work is the tenderness and the intimacy and it's both quiet and yet I can hear the music playing. Like, it's such a still capture, but in my mind, when I see this picture, I hear the music and I kind of sense the closeness and the intimacy of these men. So I think it's a really moving, I think that's its power to me. I would like to show the next slide, please. Robert Maplethorpe, Ken Moody, 1985. So here's a great quote from Tallulah Frigo about Maplethorpe's work. Quote, "He took the dark areas of human sexuality and made it into art. His exploration of LGBTQ+ culture was grand, masculine, and noble, embracing a wholly male presence without any sacrifice of feminine grace. This was entirely renegade, something never seen before, elevating the mysticism of the male experience." So I think that perfectly describes what we see here. I mean, it's a male image, and it's not only the female high heel, right? High heel shoe that connotes femininity, but the gracefulness, the curves of this figure, of this body, right? Even the black and white photography and the way the light is dancing over his body. It's such a blend of masculine and feminine that I think is really powerful. So I love both of these works, and that's why I wanted to share them with you today. While depictions of homoeroticism and some of the S&M underground that was featured in Maplethorpe's portraiture suggests much about the post-Stonewall gay sexual revolution, Maplethorpe did not consider his work to be a form of visibility politics or gay activism. Rather, he was concerned with the pursuit of beauty. That was his main interest, was capturing and portraying beauty. While Maplethorpe did not identify as an explicit advocate for gay rights, he broadcast his own sexuality and, importantly, afforded visibility to the gay community. I keep going back to this theme of visibility because it was groundbreaking, and it's so important given the centuries of erasure and omission. So that's what that's the main contribution that so many of these artists are doing, and the significance of their contribution is like it's elevating and enhancing visibility of people who have tried to erase or marginalize and force back into the closet and into hiding. Maplethorpe often used religious symbolism in his photographs. If we could see this, please, yes. Crosses and pentagrams, sometimes upside down, which can be interpreted as a symbol of the devil, but there are crosses and religious symbolism in many of his works. Maplethorpe, who was brought up as a devout Catholic, so he had a Catholic identity too, which intersected with a queer identity, right? So brought up a devout Catholic, later liked to identify with the devil because of his own sinful, in quotes, behavior. He once said that, quote, beauty and the devil are the same thing, end quote. He added, quote, I want to see the devil in all of us. That's my real turn on, end quote. But that makes me think, growing up devoutly Catholic in a Christian, largely predominantly Christian culture, was he made to feel like a devil because of his sexual orientation and his sexual identity? I mean, that whole like sinful behavior comment, making him feel like a devil. Was that superimposed on him by the morals and norms that he grew up in, and in the culture he grew up in? So I think it's interesting to me that like wanting to see the subversive, or wanting to see the devil in all people was what actually intrigued him. But it's sad to me that perhaps because he was queer, that he was made to feel like a devil or a sinner, or but those are all things that LGBTQ people hear from various faith communities around the world. Love the sinner, hate the sin, just pray for them to see the light and everything. So we are made to feel like devils sometimes by faith communities. And I think that's interesting. So I love that, like a mirror, this gold mirror cross, we're invited to see our reflections, right? That's the whole point of a mirror, is to see ourselves. But what do we see there looking back at us? Do we see, it's juxtaposed with this religious symbol? Do we see holiness? Do we see goodness? Do we see ourselves as we are? Can we see our identities reflected in a Christian symbol? I think those are all powerful questions. And I think that was some of what maybe Maplethorpe was getting to with this piece. He said, I like the form of a cross. I like its proportions. I arrange things in a Catholic way. He liked to emphasize the geometry and symmetry of his portrait subjects, and the cross is, of course, a very symmetrical shape. But again, what is the significance of a Christian cross to a gay man in the 1980s, the height of the AIDS era? The Catholic Church opposed condoms and safer sex education efforts. In 1989, ACT UP, with whom Keith Haring was involved, protested during a mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. But again, I think the juxtaposition of this religious symbol, and I think that's saying something about with just the years of Christian condemnation of gay people and queer people who were excluded from the flock and not always welcome and made to feel like less than. I just love that juxtaposition, and I think that's the power of this piece for me. All right. I'm going to have time to do one more. So I'm going to focus on the Barton Venice, Sally, Dick, and Jane Have AIDS, 2008. After his diagnosis of AIDS in 1986, Barton became an advocate for the destigmatization of AIDS. Here's a quote about him from David Groff, in his article, The Curious Closets of Barton Venice, 1999. Quote, he turned his life from a victim of the disease to a terrorist. He would inflict violence on a judgmental society. His works of art showing the lethality of a disease, end quote. His exhibition of artworks containing his own HIV-positive blood was a series called Lethal Weapons. Of that, Venice says, quote, I started making weapons, water pistols, Molotov cocktails, poisonous darts, and perfume atomizers, end quote, all filled with his own HIV-infected blood, sprayed out onto heavy paper under wired safety glass. So interestingly, when Venice took this exhibition of collection of works to Sweden, the Swedish court quarantined it and ordered that a hospital oven be used to heat the pieces to 160 degrees for 2 hours in order to kill any remaining HIV virus. And so it was very controversial. Some people really despised these works. They said, oh, it's like an AIDS horror show. And they were missing the point, though, I think, that, instead of letting the disease like AIDS define him, make him a victim, he insisted on feeling empowered. And instead of letting us a very judgmental and hostile society, it was a very dark time for gay people, especially gay men who were vilified, criminalized, just the dark ages, really. He refused to take all that passively, and he's passing his own judgment, I think. The whole role of being an art terrorist, and using his own HIV positive blood, which is a lethal weapon. I think it's such a powerful statement about not refusing to feel ashamed, refusing to be discounted, refusing to be a victim. Venice was a board member of Visual AIDS, a group that utilizes art to fight AIDS by provoking dialogue, supporting HIV positive artists, and preserving a legacy, because AIDS is not over. The Dick and Jane reading primers that were published between 1930 and 1965 were used in mid-20th century schools to help children learn how to read. So when we look at this piece, I don't know if it's easier to see there but we see that the first thing that jumped out at me was the whiteness of all the children. They're all blonde and tow-headed. I guess that's really not surprising, given that public schools weren't desegregated until 1954 with the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision. So from the 1930s until at least 1954. But I remember my public school in rural Marshall County, West Virginia. I remember in kindergarten and first grade being given Dick and Jane primers. I'm really dating myself, making myself sound ancient, but it's more a commentary about how old the books were in the school system. But yeah, so it was just a very homogenized, white, Leave It to Beaver kind of caricatures that we saw in these books. So I love the juxtapositions in these works. The whole notion of a primer. So gay men and society at large had no primer, nothing to prepare them for the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. So, the idea of a primer, then looking back from 2008, that juxtaposition I find being very powerful. I love the juxtapositions of children and innocence versus the pills for a deadly sexually transmitted diseases. Their toys are made up of the actual medications, pills, antiretrovirals, even toxic things like AZT, right? That's what's making the pile of debris or the ball that they're playing with or filling the wagon. Pills make the jump rope, and pills make the balls that the boy's playing with the cat. So I just find all of those juxtapositions very powerful and moving. So another juxtaposition, joyous, carefree play versus the grimness of trying to survive and stay alive with rigorous pill schedules and fighting an uphill battle to a disease that at that time was fatal. 2008, when the series was done, was enough time for a look back to the very dark time of the 80s. And Barton Venice died in 2012. So it's an important, I think this series and Venice's work is important art for HIV plus, HIV positive identities. Again, it's giving visibility to those identities. It's a refusal to feel ashamed. It's empowering, and I think it's very thought-provoking. I wish I had time to talk about the Michaeline Thomas. She's an important Black lesbian artist. I had lots of good things to say about that, but we're out of time. So I would like to now welcome questions from the audience and from our online.
Yes, so thank you. I will be monitoring the Q&A. And like I said, I will be repeating any live questions into the microphone for folks. And thank you so much, Brad, for this look at this exhibition from your perspective, both professional and personal. I think it was added some nuance to all of these works of art. So we very much appreciate that. And I know you already cut one artist from there, and then we had to, to leave Thomas out too, because there's so much to say. So first and foremost, I would just encourage folks to come down and see it in person so that you can really engage with all these works and these artists. But I'm going to check the Q&A now. I have nothing virtual. Do I have anything from my live folks? Any questions for Mr. Grimes?
Rebecca?
Yes, Rebecca.
I do.
Let me repeat the question for
sure.
the virtual folks. Sorry, Brad, to interrupt. So Rebecca was asking about the kind of what was mentioned about the models for the Ladies and Gentlemen series not being compensated, and the issue of potential exploitation and how that might complicate narratives about how we receive those works of art.
So I think yes and no. On the one hand, there's an account of Marsha P Johnson, famed Stonewall and gay civil rights activist, recounting how she was walking down the street and saw her portrait, right? And I'm, again, being mindful that she was paid $50, right? And then the portraits were selling for thousands of dollars, so Warhol profited immensely from these things. So yes, it could be seen as exploitative, right? Exploitative. But on the other hand, I harken back to that, like, visibility. So this brought, a marginalized subculture into the mainstream. So I think the benefit, I mean, it's sad what happened on a personal level to the models, that they weren't really fairly compensated, that many of them never even got to see the final depiction of how they were being portrayed. But I think on a larger scale, what it did for the community and for queer identities, there was a benefit by getting it out in the mainstream. So yes and no.
All right. Any other questions from our live audience?
Right.
But I was wondering, did he know about that for the rest of his life? Is he still struggling? Is he still alive?
Maplethorpe?
No.
No, he died in 89, I think.
But did he struggle with that until his death?
So that's a great question for Dr. Harris. What I read, I know that, like, he used the symbolism, the Christian symbolism, the crosses and like upside down pentagrams, but I don't know whether he was. I know that so many queer people feel like kind of abused and psychologically damaged from the messages they receive from their faith communities. You're an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. God can't love you, or God won't love you if you persist in being true to your sexual orientation or your gender identity. That can be very scarring and damaging for so many people, and has been. And I'm so glad that your mom is doing work as an ordained minister to, like, do better, right? And to send a loving message that all people are welcome and God values all people. But I don't know, like, the extent to which Maplethorpe, I mean, I see it reflected in his work several times in several ways, but do you know, Dr. Harris, if
No, I mean, I think other than the fine quotations that you shared with your research and like you said, the evidence in the work, I don't have further insight there, but I think that is that's one of the amazing things about art. And I think one of the things that I really value about having Brad here and about this lecture series is I always bring these people in, and I've actually had a couple art historians speak this semester, but often my speakers are from different fields and they say, well, I'm not an art historian. I don't know what to say or how to process this. And I think Brad's talk was a really poignant example of looking at the evidence that the artists have left us. Clearly, Maplethorpe was concerned with religion and sexuality as two prevailing themes in his artwork. And then mapping onto that our own responses and impressions. And Maplethorpe lets us do that literally in the mirror of that cross. And I think that Brad, wove some of his own personal experience and, like I said, his historical knowledge of LGBTQ rights into this. And that's why you being here and not being an art historian is exactly what we want and what we're going for.
Thank you. And I would like to add one thing. So I remember like growing up in the 80s, just the messages that, again, keeping in context in mind that it was the height of the AIDS era, right? And I remember people preaching that, well, AIDS is God's punishment for homosexuals. They brought this on themselves. They deserve it now. God is smiting them. So I can't underscore enough like the psychological damage that did to our community. And so, I mean, I can't help but think that Maplethorpe would be kind of like, okay, I'm going to use this Christian symbol in my artwork, the larger body of which incorporated some homoerotic, some S&M things, and it was very frank about gay sexuality. I think it was intentional, and I think it was pointed.
Yeah. On the virtual end, one of our resident art historians, Professor Christina Olson, would like to know if you have a favorite work in the exhibit.
I love these. I love the Barton Venice, just because I think it's so powerful. Those juxtapositions that I talked about, for me, like, because I read the primers in kindergarten and first grade, and then seeing how they've been entwined with this. And again, I think the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s really was formative in the coalescence of LGBTQ folks coming together to fight for survival together and being proud, not refusing to be ashamed of our identities and everything. So this is probably my favorite.
Yeah, and I think that's when we talked about kind of stage managing this presentation and where we would situate ourselves, both because these works are smaller and benefit from seeing the detail, but also because I know you had an affinity when we walked through this exhibition. So we're running out of time. Oh, Ella had one quick question. Go ahead, Ella. So Ella wanted to know if, despite maybe the lack of acknowledgement in the Ladies and Gentlemen series, if Warhol later in his career was politically active in the LGBT community or financially supportive of their efforts.
I would guess so, but I really don't know the answer to that. But I know that like he was open. I mean, he lived his life openly as a gay person. I don't think he made any attempts to hide his identity or his sexual orientation. So, I mean, I would be surprised if he didn't do some philanthropy or some kind of activism or support for the community, but I don't know the answer to your question.
All right. So I'm actually going to end with an appreciation that's in the chat. Joseph Lovett, who's actually one of the collectors whose work is featured in this exhibition, is tuning in with us from New York. And he says, "What a terrifically illuminating presentation. Brad made me look at work I'm very familiar with in a new and better informed way. WVU is very lucky to have such an intellect."
That's so
and
nice.
I think that that's the perfect way to close out and thank Brad, because I agree that we're very lucky to have you here on campus with us. So let's thank Brad for his time. And I also just wanted to remind you all, the artist who Brad spoke about first, Vanessa German, is actually joining us here on campus next week. On Thursday, April 7th, she'll be giving a talk at 5 p.m. in the Gladys Davis Theater at the Kennedy College of Creative Arts. She is a tremendous public speaker and performer, and will make you think about her work in new and fascinating ways. So please join us at the Davis Theater if you can, and if you cannot, we will also be live streaming that event as well, with the support of the CCA audio team who was here today, and we appreciate them and thank them for their time as well. All right, everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for coming. It means a lot to me.